Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to the channel, and thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the unsolved murder of federal prosecutor Thomas Wales. Whether you're a new subscriber or a returning viewer, you're in for a gripping exploration of one of the most puzzling and frustrating cases in recent American history. This story takes us to the dark alleys of power, retribution, and unresolved quest for justice that has lasted over 2 decades. On the night of October 11th, 2001, Thomas Wales, a well-respected federal prosecutor, was gunned down outside his home in Seattle, Washington. It was a deliberate, targeted attack that has left investigators scratching their heads and the public wondering, why would anyone want to kill a man like Thomas Wales? At first glance, Thomas seemed to be living a life free of enemies. He had dedicated much of his career to prosecuting white-collar criminals, handling high-profile banking fraud cases. But there was something more to Thomas than just a prosecutor. He was an outspoken advocate for gun control, a champion for the causes he believed in, and a man who had built a reputation of integrity and fairness. Yet, someone saw his idealism as a threat, and someone was willing to silence him forever. But who? As we open this story, we're introduced to a man who, by all accounts, should have had no reason to fear for his life. Thomas was an intellectual, a father, and a man who had dedicated his career to righting the wrongs of society. His work, especially in the areas of banking and business crime, had earned him admiration from colleagues and frustration from those who found themselves on the wrong side of his investigations. But his work in advocating for gun control was likely a spark that ignited the fire of hatred that would eventually lead to his untimely demise. On that fateful evening, Thomas Wales was at home, working in the basement of his Queen and neighborhood residence. His house was located in an upscale, peaceful area of Seattle, where gunfire was a rare sound, almost unheard of. At 10:40 p.m., the unimaginable occurred. Thomas was shot multiple times through the basement window by an unseen assailant. The attack was swift and it was cold. A neighbor, hearing the shots, reported seeing a man walking quickly down the street. He was described as a white male, moving fast under the dimly lit streetlights, before getting into a car parked a few blocks away. The man's hasty departure raised critical questions. Was this a lone gunman, or was someone else involved? Could there have been an accomplice? The investigation would eventually center on these questions, but answers would remain elusive. Thomas was rushed to the hospital, but tragically, he would not survive. His death would be declared a homicide. A life cut short, a story unfinished, and a puzzle that would perplex the authorities for years. As investigators pieced together the details, they found few clues. No clear motive surfaced immediately, and the investigation quickly became mired in confusion. Was this personal, or was it connected to his professional life? Was the gunman someone with a vendetta against him, or was Thomas simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? The investigation quickly turned to Thomas's work. As a federal prosecutor, he had made numerous enemies, but the question remained, who would go to such extremes to silence him? In an investigation that would span years, the authorities pursued multiple leads, including a suspect who seemed to have a personal grudge against Thomas, a man who had been indicted for felony fraud under Thomas's watch. However, this lead, though promising, failed to materialize into anything solid. But Thomas's work wasn't just limited to prosecuting white-collar criminals. He had also been an active advocate for gun control. He had been outspoken about the dangers of unregulated firearms, advocating for stricter laws and regulations to curb gun violence. It was this side of Thomas's career that investigators began to zero in on, believing it could play a critical role in his murder. Could someone have been angered by his outspoken stance on gun control? Thomas had frequently appeared in the media, pushing for stricter laws and advocating for change. Just days before his death, he had been involved in discussions about new proposals for background checks at gun shows. Was this the tipping point that led someone to target him? Theories began to circulate. Perhaps it was someone involved in the gun rights movement who viewed Thomas as a threat to their cause. But what became increasingly clear was that Thomas was not just a prosecutor. He was an influential figure who had made powerful enemies on both sides of the political spectrum, both in the business world and in the world of gun rights activism. As investigators explored possible suspects, one name kept resurfacing: a Bellevue commercial pilot. This man had been indicted for felony fraud by Thomas a year before the murder. He had been furious about the charges and had even sued the government, claiming the case was a wrongful prosecution. The pilot was known to have a violent temper and had expressed anger toward Thomas in the months leading up to the shooting. But when investigators approached the pilot, he refused to cooperate. His friends and family maintained that he had an alibi, although some of them had made vague comments to the media that cast doubt on his innocence. The pilot, they claimed, had expressed a desire to harm Thomas in the past. This made him a prime suspect, but there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime. As we dive deeper into this complex case, there are more layers to uncover. Was the pilot truly involved, or was he being framed? And what about the mysterious sketch of a man seen carrying a suitcase near the crime scene? Could this be the key to unlocking the truth? Before we proceed, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share your thoughts. What do you think happened that night? Could the pilot have been the killer, or was there someone else involved? Let's explore more as we proceed. When a federal prosecutor is gunned down in cold blood, the motive is usually tied to one of two things: personal issues or professional enemies. In Thomas Wales's case, the question of whether he was targeted because of his personal life or his work as a prosecutor became the focal point of the investigation. Initially, investigators looked into his personal life. Thomas had recently gone through a divorce, but by all accounts, he and his ex-wife Elizabeth remained on good terms. She had come out as gay and had moved on with her life, and there was no indication that their split had led to any animosity. There were also no signs of trouble with his children, who were in college at the time. Thus, investigators ruled out any personal motive tied to his family life. Next, attention turned to Thomas's professional life. As a federal prosecutor, Thomas had worked on dozens of high-profile cases, many of which involved white-collar criminals. These were individuals with significant financial resources, people who had the means and potential motive to retaliate against someone who had sent them to prison. But while his cases were impactful, most of the criminals Thomas had prosecuted were nonviolent offenders: bankers, fraudsters, and business criminals. Could someone from this world have been angry enough to kill? Investigators began to look at potential professional motive, suspecting that someone might have held a personal grudge against him because of his work. Yet, the more they investigated, the more elusive the link seemed. The connections between Thomas and the criminals he prosecuted appeared to be professional, and there were no obvious threats or signs of retaliation. As the investigation continued, one name surfaced repeatedly: the pilot. This commercial pilot had been indicted for felony fraud in 2000, just a year before Thomas was killed. The case had been brought to court by Thomas himself, and involved the pilot's alleged involvement in altering a military surplus helicopter for civilian use, which violated safety regulations and posed a significant risk. The indictment was a major blow to the pilot's career and reputation, and he was reportedly furious about the charges. After the charges were dropped, the pilot sued the government, claiming wrongful prosecution. His anger toward the justice system and those responsible for his legal troubles grew as the months passed. Could he have harbored enough resentment toward Thomas Wales to resort to violence? Investigators began to scrutinize the pilot's every move. They learned that he had made comments about harming Thomas in the months leading up to the murder. In fact, some witnesses reported that the pilot had expressed a desire to kill him, and investigators began to see a clear motive in the pilot's bitterness and anger. But when investigators approached the pilot for questioning, he refused to cooperate. His refusal to speak to the authorities raised more suspicion, especially when his friends and associates, though eager to clear his name in the media, declined to speak with investigators directly. Was his silence an indication of guilt, or was the pilot truly innocent? Despite the mounting suspicions, the FBI was unable to gather any hard evidence linking the pilot to the murder. They did, however, find a connection between the pilot and the world of firearms. Another potential lead. The pilot was known to be a gun enthusiast, and investigators wondered if his anger over Thomas's gun control advocacy had pushed him to commit the murder. Just as the investigation seemed to be zeroing in on the pilot, a significant twist came to light. The pilot's alibi for the night of the murder appeared to hold up. According to multiple sources, the pilot had been at home on the phone with someone when Thomas was shot, making it impossible for him to have been at the scene of the crime. This revelation threw a wrench into the investigation, as it ruled out the pilot as the actual shooter. However, this didn't completely clear him of involvement. Could the pilot have hired someone to carry out the murder on his behalf? If the motive for the killing was tied to the pilot's anger over his legal troubles and Thomas's gun control advocacy, could he have used his connections to hire a hitman? As the FBI continued to explore this theory, they began to dig deeper into the pilot's past and his potential ties to organized crime. It was during this phase that investigators uncovered another piece of disturbing information. The pilot might have had connections to a powerful Mexican drug cartel. According to reports from the DEA and federal prosecutors, the cartel had been active in the region, and there were rumors that the pilot had been involved in drug smuggling on behalf of the cartel. This theory added another layer of complexity to the case. Could the pilot's ties to the cartel have been the real reason for the murder? Despite the FBI's efforts to focus on the pilot, another lead surfaced. One of Thomas's neighbors had reported seeing a suspicious man near the crime scene shortly before the murder. The man was described as being in his late 30s or early 40s, with a slim build, black hair, tobacco-stained teeth, and a chipped front tooth. This description led to the creation of a composite sketch, which was eventually released to the public. Was this man connected to the murder? Could he have been the actual shooter? Or was he simply a witness who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? Investigators were hopeful that someone might recognize a man in the sketch, but as time passed, the lead went cold. Despite the detailed description, no one came forward to identify the man, and he was never traced. The sketch remained one of the few tangible pieces of evidence in the case, but it only deepened the mystery. Who was this man, and what role did he play in Thomas Wales' murder? Don't forget to like this video. Share your thoughts in the comment. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell for more unsolved mysteries. In 2006, an anonymous letter emerged years after Thomas's death. The letter claims to be a first-person account of the murder, written by the gunman himself. Was this a genuine confession, or was it just an opportunistic attempt by someone with no connection to the crime to involve themselves in a high-profile case? Let's break down this letter and explore its potential significance. The letter was postmarked January 23, 2006, in Las Vegas, Nevada, with a handwritten return address under the name Gig. When it arrived at the FBI Seattle office, investigators were immediately suspicious. The letter's contents were both vague and eerily specific, containing details about a crime that only someone with insider knowledge would know. However, as we'll see, there were also key elements that raised doubts about its authenticity. The letter opened with a statement from the writer regarding Thomas C. Wales. The gunman, as the letter claimed, was broke between jobs and had received an anonymous phone call offering a certain amount of money to kill Thomas Wales. The writer, claiming to have been in dire financial straits, agreed to take the job. He drove to Seattle, picked up a gun, and waited for Thomas to be in position at his computer in the basement of his home. The letter went on to describe how the writer shot Thomas twice or possibly more times before calmly retracing his steps, disposing of the weapon, and returning to Las Vegas. This confession, if it can even be called that, is chilling. It provides a detailed account of how the murder occurred, including some known facts like the location of the crime and the timing. The letter even described the layout of the house, how the writer had waited for Thomas to settle in at his computer, and how he had taken careful aim. All of this seemed to match the known details of the case. However, there were a few glaring issues with the letter that caused investigators to question its legitimacy. First, the letter referenced public details about the case, information that had been widely disseminated in the media. This made it possible that anyone with a passing interest in the case could have written it, without having any real involvement in the murder. Moreover, the letter made no mention of any specific details that only the actual killer would know. The writer did not provide any unique or incriminating information that hadn't already been revealed to the public, and the FBI noted that it lacked the guilt knowledge that someone involved in the crime would have. This led many to believe that the letter was, at best, a hoax, or at worst, an attempt to mislead investigators. One of the most important aspects of any confession or piece of communication from a criminal is the concept of guilt knowledge, details that only the perpetrator would know. In this case, the FBI carefully analyzed the letter, and while it did include details about the shooting, they were all publicly known. There was nothing in the letter that would have been exclusive to the actual shooter. This raised serious doubts. Why would the killer, someone who had just committed a murder, send a letter to the authorities, especially one that didn't reveal anything that wasn't already known? Wouldn't the killer want to remain hidden, avoiding any contact with law enforcement? Most seasoned criminals don't want to leave a trail, but here was someone potentially exposing themselves by writing to the FBI. There are a couple of theories about why the letter was sent. One possibility is that it was simply a sick attempt at notoriety. Some criminals crave attention, even if it means confessing to a crime they didn't commit. This could have been a work of someone trying to make a name for themselves in connection with a high-profile case, despite not having any real involvement. Another possibility is that the letter was an intentional effort to mislead the investigation, a red herring thrown into the mix to muddy the waters. If the killer truly had been hired to do the job, perhaps they were hoping to confuse investigators and throw them off the trail of the real perpetrator. The letter itself could have been an elaborate attempt to point the investigation in the wrong direction, either toward a random person or away from the true mastermind. Investigators followed up on the return address listed on the envelope, which pointed them to a commercial building in Las Vegas. But when they looked into it, they found no apparent connection to the murder, Thomas Wales, or anyone involved in his life, personally or professionally. The building itself seemed unrelated to the case, leaving the investigators with no solid leads from the letter's origin. But there was one intriguing piece of information: the name Gig written on a return address. Could this be a clue? Perhaps it was a nickname or a reference to something significant in the killer's past. The FBI could not determine any meaningful connection between the name and the case, and the investigation into the letter ultimately didn't yield any new suspects or leads. As far as the investigation into the letter went, it became clear that while it couldn't be completely dismissed, it wasn't the breakthrough that investigators had hoped for. There was still too much uncertainty about its origin and authenticity, and without concrete evidence to tie it to the killer, it was essentially another dead end. At the time the letter was postmarked, federal investigators were still intensely focused on Commercial Pilot, who had been indicted by Thomas in 2000 for felony fraud. The pilot was linked to the case through his bitter resentment of Thomas and his possible ties to organized crime, particularly a Mexican drug cartel. Investigators had already uncovered the pilot's connection to cartel, but there was no direct evidence to tie him to the murder. This raised the possibility that the letter, combined with the pilot's ties to the cartel, could have been an attempt to cover up the involvement of organized crime in the murder. The FBI did investigate this angle, but as with the letter itself, they couldn't make any concrete connections that would definitively link the pilot to Thomas's death. The pilot remained a person of interest, but without evidence, the case continued to stagnate. Before we move forward with the next phase of the investigation, where we dive deeper into the new leads that surfaced, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. What do you think about the letter? Is it a genuine confession or just a diversion? Stay tuned as we continue to explore the tangled web of this case. In the wake of the shooting, one of Thomas's neighbors came forward with a strange observation. This neighbor reported seeing a suspicious man near Thomas's home on the night of a murder. The man was seen pulling a black suitcase through the area, an unusual detail that piqued investigators' interest. At first, the significance of the suitcase wasn't clear. Was the man simply passing through, or was he involved in the murder? The neighbor described him as being in his late 30s or early 40s, with a slim build, black hair, tobacco-stained teeth, and a chipped front tooth. The description was enough to create a composite sketch, which was eventually released to the public. But the question remained, could this man be connected to the murder, or was he just an innocent bystander caught up in the chaos of that night? The composite sketch, now widely circulated, showed a man with distinctive features, a somewhat disheveled look, complete with a chipped tooth and stained teeth. The sketch was incredibly detailed, leaving little room for doubt in terms of physical appearance. Yet, as with many aspects of this case, the sketch led to more confusion than clarity. Despite being released to the public, the man in the sketch was never identified. What made this lead so intriguing was not just the man's appearance, but the presence of the suitcase. In most cases, a suitcase would be an innocuous object, but in the context of a murder investigation, it was a red flag. What was in the suitcase could have contained something vital, like the weapon used in the murder, or perhaps something that tied the killer to a larger organization. Investigators didn't know, but they were certain the man was no mere bystander. Unfortunately, no new information came from the sketch, and the man was never identified. As much as the public and investigators hoped the sketch would bring fresh insight, it ultimately faded into the background, leaving more questions in its wake. What had this man been doing around Thomas's home? And why had no one come forward to recognize him? The sketch and the mystery of the suspicious man came just a few years after the anonymous letter that claimed to be from the killer. But as we know, the letter was largely dismissed due to its lack of unique details and its reliance on publicly known information. Despite that, investigators still had to take the letter seriously, as they were compelled to follow up on every lead, no matter how small. Could there be a connection between the man in the sketch and the letter? The FBI and Seattle investigators began to consider this possibility. Perhaps the sketch represented someone who had ties to the crime, someone who was involved either directly or indirectly. The details in the letter, although vague, seemed to match the description of someone who could have been paid to carry out a hit, much like a contract killer or a hired gun. This line of thought brought the investigators back to a central question. Was Thomas Wales' death a professional hit, or was it the work of a deeply personal grudge? While the letter had suggested a motive of financial desperation, the sketch implied something else. Perhaps an accomplice, someone hired to assist in the murder, or someone who had an intimate knowledge of the crime scene. Could the killer have been known to Thomas? Was this man the key to unlocking the mystery? As the years wore on, the case continued to capture public attention, but the trail grew colder. The suspect in the sketch was never identified, and no one ever came forward to claim responsibility for the shooting. The authorities kept the case open, though, determined to bring justice to Thomas Wales and his family. For his family, particularly his children, the pain of losing their father so violently never truly faded. His son and daughter, now adults, continue to advocate for answers. They were left to grapple not only with the loss of their father, but with the constant uncertainty of whether the killer would ever be found. The authorities, too, continue to seek closure, despite facing seemingly insurmountable odds. The FBI's determination to use every tool at their disposal, including modern technology, forensic evidence, and fresh eyes, kept the investigation alive. Even with the passage of time, they were not willing to let this case go cold. In 2021, the Department of Justice renewed its focus on the case, increasing the reward to $2.5 million and making public promises to reevaluate all evidence. But despite their best efforts, the killer remained elusive. The identity of the man in the sketch, the contents of the suitcase, and the motive for the murder all remain unknown. Was it really a contract hit? Was there a personal vendetta at play? And if so, who had the most to gain from silencing Thomas Wales? As we wrap up this part of the story, we reflect on the investigation's twists and turns, the unanswered questions, and the ongoing fight for justice. The composite sketch and the anonymous letter are just two pieces of a much larger puzzle, one that may never be fully solved. But what remains is the memory of Thomas Wales, a man who dedicated his life to justice, a man who made enemies in both the white-collar world and the world of gun rights activism. Despite the setbacks, Thomas's case is not forgotten. His friends, family, and even the investigators who worked tirelessly to find answers have not given up. The hope remains that one day, the killer will be brought to justice, whether through a tip, a breakthrough in technology, or new information that finally connects the dots. Before we proceed with the final part of this case, where we'll explore the latest developments and revisit the investigation with fresh eyes, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Do you think the man in the sketch holds the key to solving the case, or is he just another dead-end lead? Share your thoughts and stay tuned. The search for justice has spanned over 2 decades, and as we conclude this story, we'll look at where the investigation stands today, the lasting impact of Thomas's death, and the unsolved questions that continue to haunt this case. Despite years of investigation, countless resources, and the tireless efforts of the FBI, local authorities, and Thomas's family, no one has ever been charged with his murder. As we close this chapter, the questions still loom. Who killed Thomas Wales? Was it a personal vendetta, a professional hit, or a hired contract killing? And why did someone feel the need to silence him? The story of Thomas Wales' murder might have faded into the background for some, but not for those who loved him, and not for the investigators who continue to search for answers. In 2021, as the case neared its 20th anniversary, the FBI reignited the investigation with a renewed focus. The reward for information leading to an arrest was increased to $2.5 million, a clear sign that they were not giving up on the case. This renewed effort, backed by modern forensic technology and fresh eyes on the case, showed that even after so many years, the hope for resolution was still very much alive. Along with the increased reward, authorities also made a commitment to revisit all the evidence, using updated methods for testing and re-examining old leads. In the world of crime investigations, technology has advanced dramatically, and this could mean the difference between solving the case and leaving it unsolved. For example, new DNA testing methods could reveal crucial evidence that had previously been overlooked. Even though much of the physical evidence had been processed years ago, there was still a chance that fresh technological advancements could provide new insights. Yet, despite the renewed focus and all the resources directed at the case, no new significant leads have emerged to definitively point to the killer. Investigators are still working to connect the dots, but they're grappling with the same obstacles they've faced for years: a lack of solid evidence, the absence of witnesses coming forward, and continued mystery surrounding the suspects. For Thomas's family, the fight for justice has been personal, painful, and unrelenting. His children, who were young adults when their father was killed, have had to grow up with the haunting knowledge that their father was murdered and no one has been held accountable. His son and daughter have spoken out over the years, sharing their pain, frustration, and their hope for justice. For them, every anniversary of Thomas's death serves as a reminder of the life they lost and the unanswered questions that have lingered for so long. Thomas's ex-wife, Elizabeth, despite the end of their marriage, has also been deeply affected by his death. The murder of a loved one is traumatic, no matter the circumstances, and Elizabeth has spoken about how difficult it has been to process the fact that someone took Thomas's life so callously. The emotional toll on the family has been immense, and the inability to find closure has only prolonged their grief. Thomas's colleagues, friends, and community members in Seattle also feel the loss. In the years following his death, several tributes were held in his honor, celebrating the work he did as a federal prosecutor and his dedication to justice. But no tribute can replace the man who was taken too soon, and his colleagues still feel the void that his absence has left in their professional lives. Despite the pain, Thomas's family remains committed to the search for justice. Their resolve is unbroken. Even as the years slip by without answers, they have continued to speak out, advocating for the case to stay in the public eye, and pushing for anyone who might know something to come forward. The recent increase in the reward money and renewed interest in the case has given them a glimmer of hope, even if the path forward remains uncertain. So where does the case go from here? The short answer is, no one knows, The investigation into Thomas Wales's murder remains open, but without a breakthrough, it's hard to predict when or if the case will ever be solved. There are still many unanswered questions. Who was the man in the composite sketch? Was he the actual shooter, or was he an accomplice? Could he still be out there, living a life untouched by justice? What was the motive for the murder? Was it personal vendetta, or was it linked to Thomas's work in prosecuting white-collar criminals and advocating for gun control? Could it have been an act of professional retribution? Was the pilot involved? Despite his refusal to cooperate and the lack of evidence directly linking him to the murder, investigators continue to consider him a person of interest. But could the pilot have simply been a red herring? Was the letter from the killer legitimate? The anonymous letter sent to the FBI raised more questions than answers. If it was from the killer, why would they confess to the murder in such a public way, leaving behind traces of their identity? And of course, the biggest question remains: who killed Thomas Wales and why? As time passes, the case grows colder, but the fight for justice continues. The FBI's fresh look at the evidence and the ongoing investigation give hope that one day the killer will be caught. Perhaps someone out there knows something. Maybe it's a small piece of information that, when combined with what investigators already know, could finally solve the case. In the end, the case of Thomas Wales is more than just an unsolved mystery. It's a story of a man who lived with integrity and dedication to his work, who was taken too soon, and whose legacy still lives on to the fight for justice. His death remains a painful chapter in the lives of his family, friends, and colleagues, and the search for the truth continues. The people who love him still cling to the hope that one day, someone will step forward with the information needed to bring his killer to justice. We may not have all the answers today, but as long as we continue to talk about Thomas's case, keep the memory of his life alive, and keep pushing for answers, the hope for justice will remain. Thank you for following along on this journey through the investigation into the murder of Thomas Wales. If you found this case as compelling as we have, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing to keep the conversation going. Do you think the case will ever be solved? Could new evidence finally break the case open? Share your thoughts below, and let's keep fighting for the truth.